He thought that the name Jennifer sounded great because there are a lot of Jennifers who are my age. And I'm okay with my name now. My parents are right there, so I have to say that. No, it's true. I have come to embrace my name, but when I was in middle school and high school, I wasn't such a big fan of it because everybody had it. And also, I learned what it meant, and what it means is white wave or white phantom. Which, now that I like the Marvel Comics universe, maybe White Phantom could be okay, but back then I wasn't into that stuff, so I didn't really like that either. Then I found out that Jennifer is a derivative of Guinevere, which is kind of cool, and that's the name of King Arthur's wife, but then I found out that Guinevere was an adulteress, so that wasn't so great either. So I definitely went through a phase in my adolescence where I was not happy about my name. Or maybe some other things about myself either. I have a question for you 3 or 4. Do you guys like your names? No. So this is not an unusual thing for your age group. It's really not. I know a lot of kids who just don't really like their names and probably don't like other things about themselves. And then, so when I was around you guys' age, I discovered Revelation 2:17. And in it, there's at the beginning of Revelation, there are 3 chapters that are these letters from Jesus to a whole bunch of different churches. And in this one, he's talking to a church in a place called Pergamum. And he says, "To the one who is victorious, I will give some of the hidden manna," which is cool because we don't see manna around anymore. And then he also says, "I will also give that person a white stone with a new name written on it, known only to the one who receives it." Amen. The bit about the white stone completely captivated me. I just thought, that is so cool. I want that white stone. I want to know what my name actually is. I have a name and I don't know what it is, but Jesus knows not only everything about me, Jesus knows my name. And this is part of the human condition, right? We want to know who we are. We spend a large part of our lives trying to figure out who we are, what our identity is, and then if we think we figure it out, and sometimes it changes, but we think, okay, I know who I am. And then we spend a lot of time trying to convince ourselves and other people around us, this is who I am, because it's important. Our identity is important. Reading that verse helped me know that not only did I feel like my identity was important, but it actually is important. And Jesus has something to say about it. Not only does he know my name, he gives it to me. I still don't know what my name is written on that stone. But I know I have one, and as I go along following Jesus, I'm starting to get a better and better idea of what it might be. And in the meantime, I am being transformed by Jesus to fit that name that he has already given me. And this is the truth about followers of Jesus. So there's a whole lot in today's story. It's a little hard to preach on because it's not, there was stuff happening in last week's story. This one isn't quite so much of a narrative, but there's a ton of ideas in it. And so we could pull a lot out of it. But today we're going to focus on Jesus' own question. He says, "Who do you say I am?" Today's story is about names, and it's about stones, and it's about being formed or transformed to fit the name or the identity that God is giving us. So let's get to it. We're going to start with a little recap. We've been following the journey of Simon Peter over the last few weeks, and his story is basically about the transformation of a person who started with one name and ends up with another name, and how he is being changed along the way. So we've seen a couple changes. His story started with his name. It was Simon, Simon, son of Jonah, Simon, brother of Andrew, Simon the fisherman. Those were all parts of his identity. Then Jesus came along and named him Peter, which we said at the beginning is kind of like calling him Rocky. And it was shortly after that, through a sort of private but miraculous catch of fish, that Simon actually started to be transformed into Peter. And so we've been following that. When Jesus captivated Simon's heart through that catch of fish, through this overturning of how he saw the world and how he thought the world worked, Jesus told him, you're not going to fish for fish anymore, you're going to fish for people. And we've seen Peter start to do that. He went out with the other 11 disciples and started telling people about Jesus and the kingdom, and then he went out with 72 people, and they did the same thing, and they were doing what Jesus was doing. They were healing the sick, and they were preaching about the kingdom, and they were even casting out demons. And then last week, Peter discovered that when he was really focused on Jesus, he could even walk on water like Jesus. He's being transformed to be like Jesus. And when his focus, when his vision is clear and on Jesus, he is starting to become, his identity is starting to change. So, today Jesus is with his 12 disciples again. Somehow, don't know how, they've managed to escape the crowds for a while. Depending on, we don't really know when exactly after last week's story this happened, which means we learned that if we don't know when something happened, it's not that important in the Bible, but it is after last week's story, sometime after. So what that means is it's after the feeding of the 5,000, it's after the walking on the water, it's also after the death of John the Baptist, and so it's possible that Jesus is still grieving the death of his cousin and still kind of mulling over what that means for him, because his cousin was killed for doing the will of God, and Jesus knows what's coming. Jesus hasn't told anybody about this yet, but he knows he's going to suffer even worse and even more significantly than even John the Baptist did. Last week, Jesus and his disciples were having a hard time getting away for some R&R, and this week it sounds like they're actually getting a little. It's interesting because Matthew and Luke say, they kind of focus on the fact that Jesus is traveling somewhere with his disciples. They're traveling to Caesarea. Luke says, once while Jesus was praying in private and his disciples were with him, which doesn't sound very private, does it? But it is sort of like last week when Matthew said Jesus got into a boat by himself and went to a solitary place, but the disciples were right there. So I think sometimes we think the disciples were this group of buffoons that Jesus kind of tolerated because they were the best that he could find. But he seems to, they are not a drain on his energy, apparently, because for him, being with just them and his Father is like being alone with his Father. He's completely comfortable with him. They are a tight-knit group. He's totally fine to speak to his Father, even though the 12 disciples are right there. So maybe Jesus is praying while they're walking to Caesarea, or maybe they get there and then they find some secluded place and they kind of park themselves and Jesus prays there. Either way, he may be, while he's praying, remembering his cousin and remembering that even at one point, even John the Baptist wasn't totally sure who he was. Jesus' brothers right now don't have a clue who he is. And so all of a sudden he turns to his disciples and he says, all those people we were just with, those crowds and those people that you went out to see in the towns, who do they say the Son of Man is? The Son of Man was a name that he used for himself. So the disciples throw out some stuff. Barb brought that up. All of that stuff seems, those ideas, this prophet or Elijah, or all these people in their Jewish history, it's like, but the Jews don't really have a belief in reincarnation, so what are they thinking when they suggest these things? And then the John the Baptist thing is almost weirder because, like Barb said, John the Baptist and Jesus were alive at the same time. So it's possible that maybe they thought John the Baptist had somehow bequeathed some of his spirit to Jesus, because Elijah in the Old Testament did that for Elisha, who followed him, and so maybe that's what they think. Anyway, Jesus takes all these guesses, and then he says, but they're not correct, these guesses. So then he says to his disciples, okay, so who do you guys say that I am? Here's the thing, Jesus wants to be known too. And it makes total sense. Think about it. Think about the Old Testament. Moses goes, he sees the burning bush, he asks God, who should I say to the Israelites sent me? And God says, I am. And we talked in our glory series about how God is I am, and glory is the essence of something, and God is basically the essence of existence. Nothing else could exist without him. And so, of course, he is being itself, so of course he wants us to know who he is. And of course, we want to know who we are because we are made in his image. Underneath our human search for our identity, even when it gets messy, even when it's confusing, even under identity confusion and identity politics and identity assertions and all of this stuff about so many different things, so many different characteristics that we see around us or maybe even engage in, there is something very close to God's heart going on. And we know that we all are created in the image of God, and that image is broken because of sin. So our search for identity gets messed up. We think we need to define ourselves. We think we need to find the thing about ourselves that's the most important thing, and that is how we define ourselves. We self-identify. But those things are not our source. They're not the source of who we are. God is. All of our true identity comes from him. So hang in here with me. I know it sounds a little bit like a sidetrack, but this story is about to explain what I'm trying to say. Here is Jesus. He's making himself vulnerable to his 12 closest friends. He loves them, and he's been investing himself in them. But he doesn't know for sure if they really get what he's about. His own brothers, the children of Mary and Joseph, don't understand who he's about. John the Baptist almost didn't understand what he's about. And so Jesus asks, and immediately Peter exclaims, I know, pick me. You are the Messiah, God's promised anointed one. You are son of actual God. And Jesus is stoked. You guys know what it feels like when somebody gets something about you? When you just know that they finally get it? It feels great. Jesus feels great. Jesus knows who he is. He doesn't struggle with self-doubt like we do, but now he also knows that everything that he's been saying and doing all this time with these guys is getting through to somebody. And he knows it's getting through because Peter could never have come up with this on his own. And we know that because all of the guesses from the crowds were way off. None of the crowds, not even any of the disciples, would be able to know that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the living God, if God the Father had not communicated it to them. And so Jesus is even more stoked because his whole purpose is to unite us to God, to reconcile us to God, to unite us to God. And so he says to Peter, you totally got that from my dad. This whole situation is a win. This is what Jesus came for. Actually, in John 17, Jesus prays that. He prays, I pray that you'll be one with me, as I am one with the Father, you'll be one with us, and the Father loves you like he loves me, and there's so this is like big stuff to Jesus. He's really excited. Good for you, Simon, son of Jonah, he cries out. I'm calling you Peter, you're rocky, and on this rock I will build my church so firmly that even Hades can't overcome it. Okay, this might sound even more like a sidetrack, but we got to clear up something a little bit here. I am not here to critique other branches of the church, and I want to say, first of all, that every branch in the Christian church around the world has big problems. In spite of the fact that the gates of hell will never prevail against it, we have problems. And every branch of the church has something to offer to the body of Christ. So I am not being anti any particular Christian branch at all. However, as you may know, there is a very large, historic, and important branch of the church that teaches that this passage tells us that Peter was the successor of Christ and the first pope, and that the succession of popes comes from him, and he was infallible, and so anything that any pope says afterwards, in certain contexts anyway, is also infallible. And if you look at this passage just as it is, it kind of makes sense, almost. Jesus is making a pun. It's kind of a solemn pun, which who knew there could be such a thing. But he's sort of saying, hey, Rocky, I'm going to build this church on this rock. And I'm giving you the keys of the kingdom, authority to bind things up and set things free. So how else are you supposed to interpret that? Well, here's one way. Peter's name and the word for the rock on which Jesus is going to build the church are not the same word. They're similar, but they're not the same. I knew this already, but I looked it up just to make sure I'm steering you straight, and this is what the internet says. The word Peter in Greek is Petros, which means a piece of rock, a stone, a single stone, movable, insecure, shifting, or rolling. The word rock is Petra, which means a rock, a cliff, a projecting rock, mother rock, huge mass, solid formation, fixed, immovable, enduring. Basically, Peter is like the pebble you guys got from the Dolan kids the other week, which if you weren't here and you didn't get one, I have some in my office. And Petra is like the larger-than-life boulder that is under the floorboards of this church. Not the same thing. So Jesus is not saying that Peter is the foundation of the church. That is not the identity that Jesus is giving him. Remember how at Easter we talked about that rock under the floor. We talked about the wise and foolish builders and how the wise builders build on the rock and the foolish builders build on the sand. And then we talked about how ultimately Jesus himself is the rock. Jesus doesn't need a successor because he is the foundation of the church. And this hasn't happened in the story we're looking at today, but he is alive again and forever. He is immovable. He is not going anywhere. But here is the problem with this interpretation that I just gave you. A lot of times this is as far as it goes because some of us Protestants kind of like to say, well, Catholics are wrong. And so we say the two words for rock are different, the end. But we can't ignore the fact that Jesus does say to Peter, I'm giving you the keys of the kingdom, and I'm giving you the authority to bind things up and to set things free. He's still saying some kind of surprising things, and he is still punning Peter's name on this rock. So there's a reason for this. If we looked into Peter's future, which we're going to actually do in a few more weeks, he does actually become the physical human leader of the church after Jesus goes back up to heaven. Right away, after Pentecost. It's not like in some church tradition or something. It's in the Bible. He continues to do miracles, and the words he speaks have power. But of course, he's not infallible, and I don't see anything in this passage that would make me think, oh yeah, so then after Peter, every pope, there's popes, obviously. I don't see that here. So what do we do with this? Here's what I think is happening. In this passage, Jesus is unpacking Peter's transforming identity a little bit more. In light of Peter having understood a little bit more about Jesus' identity. When they first met, Jesus seemingly randomly calls this guy Simon Peter. There's no reason that we can understand for this at that point. And shortly after that, Peter calls Jesus Lord and admits he's a sinner, and he starts to change. Now, Peter's understanding of who Jesus is has gone to the next level. And so Peter's understanding of who he himself is also going to the next level. Peter's identity is directly derived from Jesus' identity. Amen. Jesus is the rock on which his church is built. Peter is becoming like Jesus. He's preaching, he's healing, he's casting out demons, and he's even walking on the water. And now he finds out that Jesus is bestowing some kind of authority on him. Peter is like a stone chipped or even carved out of that big foundation boulder. You couldn't build an entire building on him, but he might be able to be part of the building. You could maybe say he's a chip off the old block. So maybe we should call him Chip instead of Rocky. But there's more to this story, because now it is clear to Jesus that at least one of his disciples is starting to get a picture of who he really is. And Jesus has given that same disciple a little bit more information about who that disciple is becoming. So now it's time to start cluing in all of these guys precisely on what it means for Jesus to be the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And it doesn't sound good. Like I said, Jesus hasn't talked to them about his suffering and death before, and now he starts to spell it out. Matthew says, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. From our vantage point, we know this happened, and we know the disciples didn't get it until after it happened, and we do have to kind of think, this probably sounded a little weird to them, and a little scary, and a little unsettling. And Peter has just been told that he heard from God the Father. He's been told that he's a chip off the old rock, Jesus, and that Jesus is not only the promised Messiah, but also God's Son. And Peter has not seen anything about Jesus in his experience with Jesus, and there's no reason in the world for him to think that being the Messiah, God's Son, would have anything to do with suffering. So Peter is indignant. What is Jesus' problem? Is he just still depressed because his cousin died? Or maybe he's a little overtired because of the crowds? What is up with this negative talk? Especially when he was so happy and positive like 2 seconds ago. So with newfound confidence, because Jesus just told him he was giving him the keys to the kingdom, he takes Jesus aside and he says, No, Lord, that's never going to happen to you. In the context, I almost wonder if he thought, since Jesus told him he could bind and loose spiritual realities, if he said, this will never happen to you, he thought he was going to make it never happen. It's possible. But to his surprise and dismay, Jesus rounds on him and calls him Satan. Yeah, not a good day. The father, Satan. What? So let's be clear. Jesus does not have narcissistic personality disorder, which maybe sounds weird, but it might also sound weird to say that I do think he got triggered. There is a reason he goes so far as to rebuke Satan here. And this is because Peter is presenting to him exactly the same temptations that Satan presented in the wilderness. The same ones. Satan tried to get Jesus to take the easy route, to be a people-pleasing Messiah, to be a flashy miracle Messiah, to be an expedient and successful, according to the world's standards, Messiah, to follow his dreams. You know what he's doing? He's trying to get Jesus to self-identify, to define himself by his legitimate characteristics instead of submitting his identity to his Father. This is what the serpent told Adam and Eve to do in the Garden of Eden. If you eat this fruit, you will be like God. He told them when they were already like God because they had been made in God's image and they had been given authority over creation. This is the human temptation, to define ourselves based on something good or bad about ourselves and leave God out of it entirely. So when Peter says this, suffering, torture, death, will never happen to you, Jesus is triggered because he is actually tempted by this. That's why he says to Peter, you are a stumbling block to me. Get behind me, Satan. I recognize this trick. It's satanic. You are holding me back, man. This completely defeats the reason I came here. You are presenting me with the easy way out all over again. I already resisted this in the desert. Get behind me, Satan. I'm not even really sure Jesus was talking to Peter in that one phrase. I think he was actually talking to Satan, who was using his best friend to make what sounded like a perfectly reasonable and what's more, loyal remark. It didn't work when the temptations came direct from Satan in the desert, so maybe it would work if it came from this guy that Jesus just said had heard something about him from the Father. But Jesus recognizes the temptation, and he recognizes the author of the temptation, and in his vehemence to shut it down, to not give in, he rebukes the tempter, and then he turns to Peter and says, in effect, you heard from God the first time, but not this time. This is the way mere humans think. This is the way we think. We say this stuff to each other, and we hope to hear it from each other when we're going through a hard time. You got this. You deserve better. You need to take care of yourself. Take it easy. This is all about you. And we all need encouragement, right? We do. But to Jesus, it was a temptation, and it was even satanic. And then he starts talking about what it means to be a disciple. And what does it mean? It means to be like Jesus in every way. I'm going to lay down my life, he says. You need to lay down your life too if you want to have any hope of discovering who you are. If you try to create your own identity, if you try to keep your life, it will slip right out of your hands. Amen. Oh, Peter, being like Jesus doesn't just mean you can heal the sick and feed the poor and cast out demons and preach about the kingdom, and it does mean those things, but it also means you get the keys to the kingdom, and the keys are to take up your cross and follow him. To give up your own life and your own will to Jesus. You know who Jesus was, the Messiah, the Son of the living God. You just didn't know what it meant. Jesus tells Peter, and he tells the 12, and he tells all of us that for him to be the Christ, the Son of the living God, it means he has to give up his rights to self-identity. Philippians 2 tells us Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage, or other translations say something to be grasped, something to be held on to. He didn't hang on to his equality with God. He made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. He sacrificed his true identity for us, taking on our sinful identity and dying for it. And he tells us that for us to follow him, we have to be like him in that. We have to do the same thing. We have to sacrifice our identity for him. When we become followers of Jesus, we don't get to self-identify anymore. We all have things that make us unique, some of which are socially acceptable, some of which aren't, some of which are sinful, some of which are righteous, and in this one way, it doesn't matter. Any one of these characteristics, good or bad, sinful or righteous, biblical or unbiblical, if we make it our own, if we grasp it, and define ourselves with it, it will become a stumbling block to us. It will become an idol. And it will prevent us from becoming our true selves. Satan tried to get even Jesus to self-identify with his legitimate characteristics: miracle worker, Son of God. Jesus knew that wasn't the way. He submitted his identity to his Father. He looks like his Father. God has always suffered over us. And just like the only way for Jesus to truly reflect God, to truly actively be the Son of the living God, was to let his Father define him, the only way for us to find out who we are is to let Jesus identify us, like he identified Peter, that chip off the old block. Therefore, the Apostle Paul says in the rest of the Philippians hymn, God exalted Jesus to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the living I Am. And when we follow him, we will discover not only who Jesus is, but who we are too. He is the only true source of our identity. It isn't always easy. We don't get to follow our easy way of self-identity, which is the way the world thinks we find ourselves. Our characteristics that make us unique from each other will be part of our God-given identity, but they will only be realized the way God intended them to be if he, and not the characteristics, define us. Jesus has a white stone with your name written on it. It's a name right now that only he knows. But if you're following him, I bet you're getting hints of what it is. I'm getting hints about mine too.